Tonight we are back at Life Groups, continuing our How To series. Last time at Life Groups we looked at how do we believe in God when we're full of doubt, and tonight at Life Groups we're looking at how to know our calling from God.
So I guess it's quite a big thing for many of us. We're kind of thinking, well, I want to be used by God, I want to be used by Him, and I want His Spirit to be in me. I want to do the things that He's called me to. But how do I know what God has called me to? How do I know what my giftings are? How do I know those things? And we're going to be looking at that and exploring that this evening. And I think for many of us, we kind of can go around life waiting for kind of God to speak from heaven and go, you are called to do this, and like this big booming voice. We're like, okay, now I know what I'm called to. But we need to kind of take a step back before that. Before being called to something specific, we're all called to something general. We're all called to do the basic stuff that God has called every single one of us to. You might go, well, actually, no, I want to know if I'm called to this or called to that. But actually, there's some stuff which every single one of us are called to. And you might go, well, isn't that a bit boring? I don't want to do the boring basic stuff. Maybe you know someone like this who does jobs really badly. Maybe it's you who does jobs really badly. Like your mum says to you, oh, can you do the washing up? And you're like, yeah, like do it really badly. And she looks at it and goes, that's useless. Like, I'm just going to do it instead of you because you do it so badly. And you're like, yes, got away with doing it. She's never going to ask me again because I did it really badly. And I think sometimes we can think of Christianity in the same way, that we're like, I don't want to do the basic boring jobs. I want to like kind of do the big stuff, the up on stage stuff, or the stuff that's really exciting. But when Jesus meets this guy who is called the rich young ruler, the rich young ruler says to Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he's waiting for this big answer and this big reveal. And Jesus says, well, you know the commandments. And it's kind of like Jesus is saying, look, the basic stuff, you know you need to honour your parents, you need to love God and put Him first. And there's stuff that every single one of us is called to as a Christian, generally. Now we're going to look in a minute at what it means to be called specifically. But actually there's stuff that we're all generally called to start with.
Yeah, so now you're going to discuss, there's going to be 4 verses coming up on the screen. Have a discussion, have a think about what those verses are trying to say about your calling from God.
So we've looked there at how we're all called to the same basic things, the same general things. But as well as all of us being called to those things, every single one of us is also called specifically. In 1 Corinthians 12 verse 7 it says, to each one a manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. Each of us has a role to play and a part to play. Every single one of us is being called, not just generally, but also specifically and gifted specifically.
Yeah, we're all given spiritual gifts, and it says about this in Romans 12 also. It says some are given the gift of teaching. Now you might be going, the gift of teaching? There is no way on this planet I have the gift of teaching. Well, that might not be for you. You might have the gift of hospitality. Some have the gift of generosity. Some have the gift of healing. We all have different spiritual gifts.
We all do. And you might be thinking, well, how do I know what spiritual gift I've got? And it might be that God speaks to you specifically, that He does say, as you're reading His word, something comes out and it says, yeah, that's the gift that I've got. I just know that that's what God's given me. Or He might speak to you through someone else. Someone else might come up to you and say, I really think you're gifted in this way or in that way. But here's the thing you need to know. Every single one of us is gifted. We have specific callings, specific spiritual gifts that God has given us. Up on the screen again are going to be some of those verses that we looked at earlier. Those lists of gifts from 1 Corinthians 12, from Romans 12, as Jamie read out from, and also from Ephesians 4. And what we want you to do is, as you see those lists of gifts going up on the screen, think about which ones you think, yeah, I think that could be me. Or it might be that you look at the gift and you think, that's definitely not me, but that really feels like it might be that person over there, and encourage them and say, I think you've got this gift. Or it might be that you just desire one of those gifts, and you can share that and say, I don't think I'm very good at this, but I really desire this, because the Bible encourages us to eagerly desire the spiritual gifts. So it's good to have you join us, Stuart.
Thank you.
So we've been asking the question, how do we know our calling? And obviously you're a pastor, but you weren't born a pastor.
No.
So what was that process like for you? How did you maybe start to think about and realise that you were called by God? And then what did that process look like for you?
I became a Christian when I was 15, and from the moment I became a Christian, I was involved in the church. I loved the church. I was involved in everything. We had no musicians, so I learned to play guitar because there were no other musicians in the church, and wherever I could serve, I would just do my best at serving. And then I remember the night I was 17 years old, and I was at a meeting, something like JY Live, that kind of a meeting. And a man was preaching. I just felt God say to me, I've called you to give your life for my church. And I felt God was saying to me that I would become a pastor. And I prayed with our youth pastor that night, and he said he felt exactly the same calling on my life. So it was verified, by somebody else. And then it just seemed like after that, for the next few weeks, time after time, my Bible readings were around the same kind of thing. So it just felt God saying, this is it. And then when time came for me to go to university, I felt God lead me to go into teaching, which seemed different to becoming a pastor. But I always knew deep in my heart sometime I would lead a church, serve a church full time. But immediately in front of me, as a 17-year-old, lay teaching. And so I did my very best at university. I went into teaching, and I taught as best as I possibly could. All the time I was serving in the church that I was in, just doing whatever I could to bless God's people. And then it was amazing just how God took me on this journey. And I think it was a reason, it took a long time, because from 17, hearing God say that I need to become a pastor, I only ever started really becoming a pastor when I was 35. So it was almost double that period of time in waiting, but I was massively involved in the church all that time anyway. So that was my journey. And then a time came where, out of the blue, I was a biology teacher, and they asked me if I would become a school pastor. And so then that was almost like it was the step away from teaching towards leading a church. It was a middle ground. And then a day came when our church in Wokingham said, we'd love you to come onto the team. And then Jubilee called me 7 years after that to come and lead the team here. So that's my journey in a nutshell.
Well, that's fantastic. I want to just pick up on a few things there you said. I mean, one of them was, it was listening to God for yourself. It was hearing God through other people. It was patience at times.
Yeah, lots.
And it was also, during those times of patience, it was continuing to do your very best in the place that God had put you. So working hard at university, working hard as a teacher, and continuing to serve and love the church. I think that's fantastic. I think there's lessons, like loads of lessons we can learn just in those things. But what would be your top tips? You're talking here to people 15, 16, 17, seeking God for what is it they've called them to. What would be one of maybe just 2 or 3 things you'd say, this is what you can really, I'd advise you if you're really seeking what God's calling over your life is?
I think be intentional, because I think it's very easy to just amble through life. And so just really saying to God, specifically saying, God, I'd like you to really show me the next steps. And sometimes it's not even knowing the end game, it's knowing what's my next step and being faithful in those small little steps. And God just takes you on a journey. And actually there are many times we can all tell stories where it's almost you're going in a direction and God really miraculously gives you a whole lot of signs and you change direction. But most of the time you just walk one step after the other, and God takes you on your journey. But all the time saying to God, God, would you direct my steps? I want you to lead me in my next step and my next step, my next step. And then I'm asking people around you, what do they see? What do they see in you? What do they feel with you? And weighing that up. And I've seen God over and over tie all of those things together.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Stuart, for your time. So we've just been talking to Stuart, who talked to us about his calling into ministry. But Kat, you don't need to be called into full-time ministry to be called by God.
No, definitely not.
Definitely not. And you're a teacher and a mum and a wife, and You've been serving in the church for how many years?
Well, I became a Christian 21 years ago when I was 17, so feels like a very long time.
And you've been serving in roles for the church ever since then, really?
Yeah, so I started going to church when I was 17 and became a Christian quite quickly. And I just had a really good youth leader. And the following year, when I was due to go to university, I ended up taking a gap year and working for the church. And that was just, for me, kind of the beginning of it all, really, because he was absolutely brilliant and he just got me doing all sorts of things. You know, things that I would never have chosen to do, things that I often didn't feel I really wanted to do. It was just kind of automatic. Oh, you're doing this week, you're leading this, you're speaking about this, you're working with these people. And so I got a taste of everything. And I think through doing that, some of the things I loved, some of the things I didn't like so much, some were stressful, some were fun. But because it was just all stuff that I was doing with the people I loved, it was a great church, it was a great team, he was a really great leader and a great boss to have. I enjoy, even if I didn't enjoy the things I did, I enjoyed the fact I was doing them. And I think through experiencing all that, it kind of helped me to figure out the things that I loved and was good at, as well as the things that I thought, actually, that causes too much stress, or I can see that there are other people who do that a lot better. So for me, that was a really great grounding and start into my life as a Christian.
And what would be, if you're going to give some top tips for someone developing in the gifting and what they feel God might be calling them to, what would be the sort of maybe two or three things you'd say, this is what you should do to develop your gift and figure out what God's calling you to?
So I think my experience that year of doing so many different things helped, because I'd always known that I wanted to be a teacher, so my job is teaching children, and that's something I always knew I wanted to do, but I didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do as a Christian. And because I'd had that year working for the church, a little bit of me thought, well, you know, all the good Christians work for a church, and you know, that's the best way of giving and serving and using your gifts. And actually, while there are lots of people who are called to work for the church, we need far more people not in the church, because there are far more people in the world not in church than there are in church. So I think for me it was working out the fact that I could do stuff at church, but that I had a job as well where I could be ministering to people and using my gifts outside. So I think that opportunity of working for the church that year gave me insight into lots of things. I led some children's groups, I mostly worked with the teenagers, I did some adult things, some speaking, and through that I figured out the things that I loved. I discovered that although I knew I liked teaching in school and teaching children, I discovered that it wasn't just teaching people how to read, teaching sums, it was actually the whole teaching in the bigger sense, which is helping people to learn and find out about something. So that's something that I can then transfer into anything. So I can use that in youth work, you know, tonight with this, I can use that when I'm meeting up with someone to chat about something, in the life group that we lead. That gift of teaching doesn't have to look like sitting in front of a class of 30 people. It's helping people to know more about anything, to helping them get through life, helping them to experience new things. And that's a gift that you can literally apply in any job, whether you're working for the church or not, whether you're a student, whether you're a child at home with your family. You're never too old or young to be able to use a gift.
Fantastic. And so what we want you guys to do now is to discuss in your groups, maybe break down into smaller groups, about what you're actually practically going to do to think about developing the gifting and the talent you think you might have and what God is calling you to.